Welcome to PBO Perspectives in Business, Finance, and HR, where we empower businesses with expert advice and practical solutions that drive success. Join us as we break down the complex business topics of today and share insights on maximizing efficiencies and increasing profitability. Hi, welcome back to the PBO podcast. This is Joey McCoy, and I'm here with Fran and Nicole, and we're going to talk about something that you may have heard of called PAGA. It's got $15 million to $150 million claims. Is that correct? So some outrageously high, expensive numbers right here that you could be responsible for. And we're going to talk about ways to avoid those type of penalties. And I'll throw it to Nicole to kind of just give us an overall, what is PAGA? Maybe if you could just break it down for us.
Yeah, thank you for that. So PAGA actually is an acronym, and it stands for Private Attorneys General Act. And it actually is sort of an overarching act that is in the state of California that governs a variety of different labor codes, anything actually in the California Labor Code that can be brought in a lawsuit by employees. And so it's sort of this all-encompassing act that is given an avenue for employees to take to sue on common claims like wage and hour and those types of things. So,
when did PAGA start? Where did this come from? Because I just heard about it this year for the first time, to be quite honest with you, but I think it's been around for a little bit, hasn't it?
It has. So it actually started in 2004 is when it originally was brought to California and enacted into law. It really started to pick up traction, I think, as we saw increases of claims probably around 5 or 6 years ago, is word on the street from our strategic partners, the employment attorneys. And so they've seen a lot of movement in the space, and which is why I think there's a lot of push at the legislative level to put some framework and guardrails around what can and can't happen, which is why I think you're seeing movement in 2025 on that.
In terms of, every year we get a bunch of employment law updates. And in terms of the updates that we got this year, is this one of the bigger ones? Or why is this one getting more kind of talked about recently?
Yeah, so if you're an employer in the state of California, you got one for the win this year. Yeah, so it didn't quite land the way employers were hoping it would land. In November of 2024, they actually had talked about potentially capping things like the plaintiff attorney's fees, et cetera. It didn't quite go that far, but the good news is that employers have been given a lot more freedom to what they call a cure, right? To sort of fix whatever the allegations are and the violations, unintended or otherwise, might be. And then, so they've sort of opened that scope, which is nice. And it's also positioned employers, if you are smart and are proactive about building a culture of compliance and you're doing regular audits and showing a good faith effort to stay in compliance, you actually have massive reductions that they've put numbers around now, depending on if you're, again, doing that on a regular cadence. So for some specifics, the numbers are 85% is the potential savings, right? So let's say you have $1.2 million in potential fines and penalties. If you can prove that you have taken reasonable steps to mitigate that risk and stay on top of that, it actually can save you 85% of that, so netting at around $180,000. I'll speak to the CFO on the numbers, but I'm
define what reasonable steps are. Like, what's a reasonable step?
Yeah, so it comes in 1,000 different ways, to be honest. But some of the reasonable steps that they're talking about are trainings for your managers, for example. And are you putting in policy and process that's compliant? So specific, you really want to look at your top 10 heaviest hitters within the ordinance that typically gets sued, right? So we tell our clients, hey, look at your wage and hour violations, overtime, double time, split shifts, look at your meal penalties, look at your rest periods, are your wage statements looking right? So we talk a lot about misclassifications. We deal with this with our clients a lot, right? It's a big one. So they really want to move people into the exempt status. They really should be classified as non-exempt. And so it is just an opener, right? It's a game-changing opener for these types of classification lawsuits. Simple things in the state of California, like an unreimbursed expenses, right? General rule, you can't really pass along business expenses to employees. It's a gray area, and so people like to walk the line. And
yes, they do.
Yeah, state of California has opened the door for employees to call them on it.
Yes. And I mean, this is going to keep the HR people busy, isn't it? So a lot of HR stuff in there. You got training, you got payroll, you got audits, compliance. But as far as like on the accounting side, Fran, what would you say are some areas that maybe you're seeing affect some of your clients with PAGA?
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
it's always
thank you
good to
for
be
being here.
Firstly, it is really a big win that we got this law in November of 2024 from an employer point of view, because prior to this law coming in, there was no ability for us to put some best practices into place to be able to, number one, identify the areas where we were perhaps non-compliant and we didn't even know we were.
Yeah.
So, it's a
way to look on the positive side.
Exactly. And so, it's always good to understand the rules and the best practices and then implement them in a way that minimizes our risk and also minimizes the penalties and the fines. So, on the finance and accounting side, we're always looking at ways to mitigate risk and looking at our practices in wage and hour and how we process payroll, how we train our folks is really important. Not only from the, oh my gosh, we're going to get a fine, but it makes us run our businesses better. Our employees are happier, of course, because we all understand the rules and we all do better when we understand the rules we're playing by. So, one of the challenges with PAGA and these particular lawsuits that are coming about for employers is that you can't get insurance for it. So if you get a $150 million claim,
oh my gosh,
you have to fight that. Yeah,
claim.
can you imagine? Firstly, you're having to pay out money to your employees potentially, and you're paying fines as well. So, and there is no insurance to protect you from it. So the only insurance you have is to really understand what are all the rules and how you can best play by them and continue to monitor, with regular audits and or best practice reviews. I suspect that with our clients that have auditors where they have to have audits, that this will be something that will be looked at once we have a better understanding of the implications. With our nonprofit clients, it's likely that can impact their audits and the way their auditors are approaching how they do payroll processing, how they do cost reimbursement processing. All of these best practices will flow into other areas of the business, and that all has financial implications to it.
Yeah. So what are maybe some high risk, like what industries are maybe the more high risk of getting a PAGA claim than others?
That is a great question.
So there are some that are more probably acutely aware of what PAGA is than others.
Yes, if they know if they're listening.
So I suspect you're in things like construction, anything with a high employee classification with non-exempt and or complex payroll, right? So distributors, manufacturing, a lot of hospitality,
warehousing,
healthcare. So, there's a lot of, and, plaintiffs' attorneys know where to go to find these particular employee classifications, and janitorial services is another big one. And so, employers really have been open the door from a legal standpoint to at least try to protect themselves in some form or fashion to mitigate the risk. And so one of the other large changes we should at least briefly touch on that was impactful for this year is that, PAGA allows, if the Labor Commission is not going to take on the wage and hour claim, and then it allows, right, for the employee to move forward, the employee now has to, in the past, the employee could file on behalf of themselves and everybody else within the company who falls within that same employee classification, whether or not they themselves had actually had that infraction, that violation happen to them.
Very interesting.
So I could file on behalf of you, Joey, and not even have
I
had
would
that
not like
situation happen to me, right? So now the law has changed, saying, no, actually the employee has to actually have incurred that violation themselves in order to be able to file, right, like for each one of these infractions.
Gotcha.
So that has also sort of helped narrow down the fraudulent claims that they've seen happen also.
So one infraction could be one infraction in a pay period, but the penalties and fines and back pay could be for multiple pay periods, multiple years.
Yeah.
So we're talking about significant dollars for one employee times X number of employees. So you start to do the math on this, and if you've got companies that have many non-exempt workers, and they get themselves in a situation where maybe they had a setting wrong in their payroll system. We all know these payroll systems are complex. Sometimes they change things and we're not familiar with them if we're processing payroll, and that one infraction could cost lots of money to an employer. So having these annual reviews of what are the laws, what are we doing to make sure that we're complying is really important on the accounting side and the payroll side and the HR side. So that's what's beautiful about our team, is that we've been able to integrate. Our accounting folks are looking at it from the accounting perspective and the finance perspective, and the HR team is saying, oh yes, we need to look at it from this perspective as well. So it's really great for us to be able to work together that way.
Yeah, I think, maybe the moral of the story is just do regular audits, like quarterly audits on your payroll, really. I mean, because there's so much room for error when you have a lot of hourly employees. There's a lot of room for error, and things don't get noticed, and the employees might not even know it either. So I did kind of want to, location-wise, is this just a California thing? I mean, we're special here in California, but is anybody else having to deal with this across the country?
Yeah. Well, we like to lead the charge,
yes,
right?
We do.
So PAGA is actually specific to the state of California. And I think it is important to note, too, when we talk about the employees and sort of best practices we've mentioned in the state of California, laws change like a bullet train around here, right? So it's really important that you have subject matter experts on your team that understand the rules, understand the laws, understand the systems, the system capabilities. And so to do audits is one thing. To have strong policy and process in place, another. And then, the behavior that is surrounded for how our managers are interpreting those policies, right? So we can have the best policies in the world, but if we have managers who aren't trained well and or are out there preventing rest periods, nope, we really got to get this work done, so we got to miss that meal penalty, right? Or period, excuse me. That type of behavior is actually what ends up getting us sued, because it impacts this right compliance culture. It's counterintuitive to that, and it impacts the employee's experience with us as the employer. So there's the hard copy data, right, which is the payroll audits, the wage and hour reviews, the policy reviews, all of those. That's that hard copy data, right? And then there is, but how are we behaving as an organization as those two things align? And oftentimes what we see is the policy is in place, the system might capture it, but the behavior that's actually happening in the field is there's a massive disconnect. And so how do we connect those two things? Because when we do qualitative interviews with employees, the story that's told and that narrative often looks different than what the actual black and white of the policy says. So training is critical.
Yeah, I think one of the big misconceptions, from HR and accounting is that sometimes the HR people think that accounting's got it covered, and sometimes the accounting people think HR's got it covered, and really none of them have it covered. So, and so maybe you can speak to some of the other misconceptions that are out there about, who should be handling these kind of things.
Yeah, so I think what's really important from my vantage point, and this might be a chief people officer answer, when you look at the entire body of work, then how do we resource that work appropriately, right? So what talent makes the most sense and or technology makes the most sense to bring all of that together in its totality? So for example, it's important to know what skill sets you need. And then also, for example, like attorneys are fantastic.
Yeah, I was going to say, when do you bring in an attorney?
Right.
When's the right moment to do that?
Right?
Yeah, they
attorneys
are
are fantastic. They're going to write policy. They're going to talk to you about compliance, and they know their stuff, right? But when it talks about the financial investment of that, and it talks about the rollout from a process, and then we talk about the behavior that's actually happening operationally within our organization, they start to fall off there, right? So great for policy, great for compliance and education. When we talk about practical application, then HR sort of picks up the ball from there, right? To look at the policy, how does that impact culture? What does that look like? And, we have an internal conversations a lot about who should own payroll, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that accounting? Is that HR?
It floats around.
It floats. Yeah, it depends on who you are in the world, I
and your
suppose.
business model and what's
So
needed
many
with
different
that payroll.
answers.
Yeah, there are really, and there's no one answer. I think the answer in regards to who owns what is it really does take a village, and the policy part is in some ways the easy part. The I can't say that word. Operational implementation of that is one altogether, which really ties in not even the accounting and the finance and the HR people. It's the boots on the ground, and like Nicole said, we may be thinking. We're sitting in our back office thinking one thing is happening when the experience of the employee is very different. So it really does take that village, and for us to, as a company brand and culture, ingrain it in all conversations. And when we're dealing with employees, that is the biggest opportunity for all of us to get on the same page and make sure that we're walking the talk and implementing what we say we're doing.
Yeah, and speaking of payroll, a lot of people assume the payroll provider, if they use ADP or if they use TriNet or whoever they're using, they assume that they're catching things, and they're really not. I mean, the buck stops with the company, and I think that's another big misconception is the payroll provider isn't responsible for that at the end of the day.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we actually have, a payroll company that has a PAGA claim against them.
Oh,
you can
wow.
imagine
Well,
that.
there you go.
It's shocking, and we shouldn't lean on the payroll company. It's really not their job. They don't understand the intricacies of our business model and how our employees are working. And so unless they're in the trenches with us and they're having conversations with our ops people and our HR and our accounting people, they don't really know.
Yeah.
And so it's important for us to recognize that if we're leaning on the payroll company to back us in this way, they're not taking that on. They don't see that as their responsibility.
Yeah, and they might not even be located in California,
Right.
which then they're not really
Exactly.
like experts on, state law here, and it is a beast. So I did just want to ask before we close out, how do arbitration agreements come into play with this?
Yeah, so arbitration agreements are definitely a best practice in the state of California. There's been some back and forth on whether they're enforceable, not enforceable, but they are in fact enforceable, assuming that they're not, doing anything crazy, and you're not like burying it in a handbook, right, where no one actually understands they're signing their right away to arbitration.
Yeah, it's hidden.
So there is some best practice on how to do an arbitration. Attorneys will tell you, because the changes to arbitration happen frequently, that you should have that updated annually. As it relates to PAGA, my understanding of the arbitration agreement is that it can compel the individual, meaning the employee that is filing the suit, to have their particular part of the lawsuit litigated within the arbitration setting, but it does not necessarily get them out from underneath the rest of the employee classification. So it's a good step. It's not all inclusive to be preventative, but it is a good step because at least can put some sort of framework and barrier for the employer.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else you all want to add about this? Like tips on, best practices on how to avoid these types of claims? I guess I just want to reiterate, it's $100 per employee per violation per pay period. You have
The first one.
Yeah, you have 200 employees. That's going to add up real quick. So definitely something you want to avoid. Any best practices to...
I mean, for me, I would say, obviously, reviewing policies, having good procedures in place, annual audits are really good steps, making sure that you have trainings that are happening. The other thing that I will say that is also typically recommended by employment attorneys is that audits are great, but if you really want a strong case in terms of ability to defend, probably recommend somebody independent of your internal team, right, to come in and look at it if you're really looking.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, so it's no different than any other audit, right? You have people who come in and independently audit your finances for a reason, and it's because they don't have a dog in that race, right? So part of that is from a neutrality, was that a word? A neutral perspective. You really want to make sure that somebody is looking at it with a fresh set of eyes.
Yeah, for sure.
And making recommendations. So the other part too, as you mentioned, HR accounting, how does that work together? When these lawsuits happen, there's going to be a massive impact to cash flow. You're going to have to figure that out. And then also from a HR perspective, we need to get better at building the business case for CFOs or CEOs or whomever we're counterparts to about the investments that are critical to keep us in compliance, whether that's from a skill, from a talent perspective, right, having the right subject matter experts at the table, and or from a systems perspective, from a training perspective.
Having enough staff.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of that we need to do a really good job of building the business case to mitigate risk and partner with our CFOs so that we can come to the CEO and the C-suite together, right, to champion the compliance component, so that, because it has a big business case around it.
It really does. I did a mini little assessment of, if you have this many 10 to 25 employees, you have 25 to 50 employees, you have over 50 to 100 employees, and you do the math on one infraction.
Oh, wow.
And you say, okay, well, if I get a claim, it's going to cost X. If I had hired a third-party auditor to come in, or a third-party compliance person to come in and just take a look and give me guidance, and I could have reduced my penalties by 85%, it pays for itself
it's an investment.
100-fold.
Yeah.
And not only does it do that, so there's that financial implication, but there's also that commitment to your employees and your brand culture. You're telling your employees, we care about the laws, we want to be compliant, we're doing the best that we can to be able to comply, and we're going to look at these things. And so, as a CFO, running those numbers and looking at the dollars, it's a no-brainer every time. It's like when you look at insurance and you say, oh my gosh, this premium is X amount of dollars.
I hate paying my
say,
car insurance.
One little accident,
exactly.
and
You're
you say, oh, this is why I have it. And then you really are speaking the language of the folks that are minimizing risk wherever they can, and they're responsible for the bottom line and running a profitable business. And if they get hit with any of these types of fines, it does impact them greatly.
For sure. And it's a hit on the brand when you have big claims like that. It's not a good look for multiple reasons.
No.
How can you recruit if you know?
Yeah, recruiting. Yeah.
Well, and they are public, right? So I think
Yeah.
most people don't realize it is public information when a PAGA suit is filed. There's a database you can pull it and you can see who's actually which companies have had a lawsuit filed. And, even on the merger or acquisition side of the house, even if you're looking to exit, right? So you have to disclose that you have been through this type of a lawsuit. And then those things, when you're going out for investment, when you're going out for any kind of acquisition, meaning you're trying to be acquired, et cetera, those are all things you have to consider when you're looking at, they want to know, am I purchasing a company that takes compliance seriously? They're going to protect the dollars I'm about to invest, right? And so that doesn't tell the right story if you're
for sure. They don't know all the details that happened. Yeah.
No, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle once it's out, right?
No.
So whether you thought that was frivolous or not, it won't matter. It's on record.
That's right.
Well, my tip is make sure everyone goes on their meal periods.
A full 30 minutes uninterrupted.
A lunch will save you a lot of money in the end.
Don't round.
No rounding.
No rounding
Overtime.
allowed.
Yeah, earlier is better, before the 5th hour. So anyways, well, that's all we have for this topic. So let's hope that we don't get any PAGA notices anytime soon. And
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of PBO Perspectives in Business, Finance, and HR. We hope you found today's insights valuable. For more information about PBO Advisory Group, please visit our website at pboadvisory.com. And be sure to subscribe and join us again next time as we continue to explore more ways for businesses to drive success.